Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Walker, Executive Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to our panel discussion titled The Authoritarian Resurgence, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Today's discussion is part of a larger initiative that's being undertaken by the International Forum, examining the ways in which leading authoritarian regimes are increasingly exerting influence and challenging democratic norms. The relative influence of these regimes has grown at a time when the leading democracies are retrenching. Therefore, a quarter century after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the trajectories of influence of the world's leading democratic and anti-democratic powers appear to be moving in opposite directions. Our initiative is looking at key authoritarian countries under discussion today, but we are also examining key thematic areas in which authoritarians are learning from each other and cooperating. And these areas have included the global authoritarian crackdown on civil society, increasing efforts to block free expression on the Internet and to shape Internet governance, the growing authoritarian ambitions in international media with such initiatives like RT and CCTV and Telesur, the wider idea of the establishment of counter norms to the norms that have been since the end of the Cold War, and a sub-piece of this which turned out to be a very interesting examination that we've done, and we'll have an article on this in the very near future in the Journal of Democracy, on the ways in which authoritarians are creating alternative initiatives to monitor and observe elections. Articles on all of the countries I've mentioned and the thematic issues I've just alluded to are being published in the Journal of Democracy and then subsequently in an edited volume on this subject. And in fact, all four of our panelists have authored articles on this topic for the Journal. Andrew Nathan's article titled China's Challenge appeared in the January 2015 issue. Articles by Lilia Shevtsova, Fred Wehrey, and Javier Corrales appear in the just-released April 2015 issue, which also includes articles on Iran by Abbas Milani and Alex Vitanka. You can learn more about the journal and find several freely available articles in the new issue at www.journalofdemocracy.org. The examination we've undertaken in the course of the last decade, autocratic regimes have become increasingly adept at using modern methods to obstruct dissent. During this time, their repression of independent voices has become more sophisticated. These regimes have learned how to apply the forms of law to repress independent civil society, while also developing modern techniques to manipulate media, both online and off. In many cases, they've marketized their economies, but then use the market to upgrade their tools of repression. But arguably the most crucial adaptation by the autocrats has been the leap from blocking democracy within their borders to methodically disrupting it beyond it. These regimes are seeking to gain ascendancy in the respective regions and also to reshape the rules-based institutions that have been critical in setting global democratic norms. They may disagree on many things, but share the objective of containing the spread of democracy and weakening the influence of democratic principles in the world. And given the extent of the challenge to democratic norms, the established democracies need to think with far greater seriousness about a strategy of how to respond. Challenges presented by four of the leading authoritarian states. We have four leading specialists who will share their insights. And now it's my pleasure to introduce them. All of them are well-known experts who have extensive biographies. You have the full biographies in the handouts we've made available, so I'm not going to read them in their entirety. I'm just going to give the current title of the panelists so that we can get right into the discussion. To my immediate right is Andrew Nathan, who is the class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia University, and he's also a member of NED's board. To my immediate left is Lilia Shevtsova, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. To Lilia's left is Javier Corrales, who's a professor of political science at Amherst College. And on the far right is Fred Wehrey, a senior associate in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Just a brief word on social media for those of you who wish to follow. For those of you who are on Twitter, you can follow this discussion and contribute to the conversation by following the forum at Think Democracy, and you can follow the National Endowment for Democracy at Ned Democracy, and by using the hashtag NedEvents. I'd like to take a moment to express my thanks to the forum staff who's done so much work on this larger initiative and helped put this event together today. And finally, I'd like to ask everyone to join me in silencing their cell phones before we get started, if you haven't done that already. We'll go in alphabetical order of the countries, and we'll start with Andrew Nathan on China.
Thanks, Chris. So this whole project of authoritarian resurgence was Chris's idea, and he has pulled it together. So I want to thank him and pay tribute to him because it's a very interesting topic. And when he asked me to write about China's role in counteracting what we do at NED, with counteracting democracy, I really found it a more difficult topic than one might think. It's been a stimulating thing to think about it, and I'm not sure that my article gets it completely right, and I'm still thinking about it. Maybe today I'll get some more thoughts from you. One of the reasons why it's tricky to deal with it is that, in my judgment, China doesn't have an active anti-democracy program. They don't have a crusade to authoritarian regimes around the world. There was a thing like that in the Mao period. Mao's regime didn't have much impact, but it did have a policy of supporting pro-China revolutionary movements, and it was part of the period of time when communism was an ideology that wanted to spread itself around. But today, Chinese foreign policy is really pragmatic. They're willing to deal with democratic regimes if that's the kind of regime that exists in a country that they're dealing with. And of course, because they're so big and their economic ties are so widespread, they're dealing with virtually every regime in the world without prejudice to what type of regime it is. And so far as I know, they don't have cells and movements and things like that and subversion going on in the democracies to try to change them. They don't have a theory of the authoritarian peace, if you will, that says that it's better for them. In fact, although they probably find it easier, as indeed many deal with an authoritarian government because you know who's in charge, and as long as that person has enough power, you can get things done. But there are some times when dealing with an authoritarian government is inconvenient for them, like North Korea. So I don't think they have a intentional type policy, and I argue in my article their policy is regime type neutral. However, because China, it really has an influence all around the world. And in the article, which you may have read because it has been published, the other ones are just coming out now, but mine has been out since January, I try to tease out 6 ways in which I think China does have a deleterious effect on democracy around the world. And the first one is the power of example, the China model. So what characterizes the China model, or how the China model at least is understood by many in the world, to what it means to many, is that the old idea that you couldn't have a highly modernized society without democracy because the middle class would doesn't seem to be true by the China model. Of course, it remains to be seen what's going to happen in China, but as of today, China looks to be flourishing as an authoritarian regime, and not really a soft authoritarian regime either. It's pretty tough when it comes to dissent and to civil society. They've combined authoritarianism with rapid economic growth. They've combined authoritarianism with a very active internet and social media, which people used to say the internet will overthrow authoritarian regimes. They've authoritarianism, especially interestingly, with at this moment in time, as far as we can tell, widespread legitimacy among the people. This is not a regime that that survives by repression alone. It uses targeted repression against those whom it thinks are challenging it or whom it thinks present some kind of a risk. But surveys find, and my own impression from people I talk to, is that the broad middle class pretty much supports the regime for various reasons. So people call this the China model. They call it consultative authoritarianism. They call it meritocratic authoritarianism. There are all kinds of, or model writ large, there are all kinds of ways of thinking about how this thing works. But just the fact that it, for the moment, seems to work empowers other authoritarian regimes, gives them greater morale, makes them feel that they're not doomed. And I'm not sure that any other authoritarian regime can really emulate the Chinese model. You think about, say, Mugabe trying to do a China thing. He doesn't have the apparatus. He doesn't have all the assets that China has. But many authoritarians around the world, I think, feel that they can learn from China. So, and they certainly can learn parts of what the Chinese do, the control of the internet, the passing of certain laws. But that comes to another point, my third point. The second point that I wanted to make in the article is that China has mounted a massive soft power effort around the world. We see it here with inserts of the China Daily in the New York Times. I suppose they exist in the Washington Post as well, which I don't see. And if you search around on your cable TV, you can find China Central Television. But I don't know that Chinese soft power has that big of an impact here in the States. But in some parts of the world, it has a very large impact. And something like the Xinhua news agency, the official news agency, which has a lot of actual news in it that's very useful and just facts. It also has a lot of news about China, which is all positive. A lot of newspapers around the world will pick that up because it's free. And Confucius Institutes are having a big impact in the American Academy and elsewhere around the world. And the effort of China's soft power is really not about authoritarianism as such. It's about China as a great nation, as a benevolent nation, about Chinese culture as a culture of harmony. It's about China's win-win relationships with other communities around the world. But so it's not primarily targeted on the question of regime type, but the question of regime type is inseparable from the image of China, so it really does come in. China works, China's system works. And also a lot of it is emphasizing the mutual respect that China argues all cultures should have for each other. No culture is superior. And this is a cultural relativism argument that goes against democracy promotion, although democracy promotion is not a theory that some cultures are superior, but it is constructed as by the Chinese and by other targets of democracy promotion. Democracy promotion is constructed as a Western cultural imposition, and so the Chinese soft power effort fights back against that idea. The third impact of China, and I began to allude to it, is in the exchange of more concrete techniques for authoritarian rule. And this is research. I didn't get a lot of smoking guns in my article on this, but I'm sure it's there, and as time goes by, we'll learn more about it. But the Chinese have pioneered, and I think lead the world in surveillance of the internet and control of the internet, and I'm pretty sure that other countries with sophisticated internet police are learning from the Chinese. The Chinese are, along with the Russians and to some extent the Egyptians and others as well, have pioneered in passing laws that have of law, but which don't look lawful from a Western, from my perspective, which serve to provide a form of law for repressing civil society. This charge that they put against many civil society actors of making trouble, is an item in the Chinese criminal law. They are now considering a law for making it very difficult for outside funders to remit funds to organizations inside China. And since those organizations inside China can barely raise any money inside China because they're sensitive and rely to a significant extent on outside money, if they pass this law, will make it very tough on us, and so on. Other areas of legal regulation. The fourth point that I brought up in the article is a little bit parochial to China, but it's still important, which is the Chinese resistance to democratization within territories that they, well, in short, in Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, territories that they claim and where they have a special kind of influence. In the case of Macau and Hong Kong, they control them, but strongly. So I think it was yesterday or the day before that the Hong Kong government presented to the Legislative Council the election plan for 2017. There's been a long story behind this and demonstrations that took place in Hong Kong to resist this election plan. But basically, Beijing is saying to the Hong Kong people, you can elect your chief executive from among 2 or 3 candidates that we will choose. And so it's not really democracy. So they had promised, when Hong Kong reverted to Chinese control in 1997, Beijing promised a gradual democratization process, but it turns out to be empty. In Taiwan, you do have a flourishing democracy, but Beijing always pushes against the operations of that democracy to go where it will, to do what it wants to do, and says that it's not legitimate, for example, for Taiwan to hold referenda on issues of Taiwan's international status because Taiwan has no right of determination. And when Taiwan elects a president that Beijing doesn't like, then Beijing will push back against that president, as happened before the current president and may happen again now, because the person currently tipped to most likely win the next presidential election next year is the opposition candidate. The fifth point in the essay is to say that in China's pragmatic foreign policy, which is regime type neutral, they are willing to deal with democratic regimes, but they're also very, very willing to deal with authoritarian regimes, of which there are quite a few around the world. And in doing so, China will help those to survive. The former Burmese regime until it changed on its own, the former Sri Lanka regime until it changed on its own, various regimes in Africa, Sudan, for example. The Chinese position in some of these regimes is not absolutely 100% authoritarianism no matter what. So in Sudan, for example, they have gone along with the African Union. The African Union wanted, China allowed the UN then to vote for a peacekeeping operation in Sudan. China's not in favor of genocide, for example, doesn't promote genocide, but nonetheless is very happy. Arms to Mugabe, sell arms to Khartoum to get along with whoever is in charge. And if they weren't doing that, their support is significant for these regimes and helps them to resist. The final point in my essay is that China's played an active role in shaping some of the important international institutions where we hope that democratic norms will be advanced. So an example of that is the Human Rights Council in the United Nations, and China is not the only one, but along with many other countries who think the way China does, that don't want the actions of the Human Rights Council to be targeted on human rights abusing countries. China helped to shape the procedures of that council in such a way that they're non-selective is the phrase. And so you have a process called universal periodic review, which subjects every country of the UN to the same review and does it in a manner that's extremely friendly to the country being examined. So this replaced a former procedure in which members of the states that were members of the preceding Human Rights Commission could bring up motions against human rights situations in particular countries. That's gone, and China has shaped that. They've shaped the way in which UN humanitarian intervention. It's not that China bans humanitarian intervention, but it has, as a permanent five-member, has a big role in shaping those resolutions. It has shaped the norms for human rights dialogues that China holds with other countries in ways that make those dialogues toothless. It'll be interesting to see how the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China is setting up, what kind of lending norms it will use, and they are signaling that they'll be using lending norms similar to the World Bank, and ADB, which are not that great from a democracy and human rights point of view, but there's something there at least. And we'll see whether the AIIB is less human rights friendly than the existing norms. So I would say that China's impact is in these ways kind of indirect. Its main purpose is to defend its own interests and make sure that it doesn't get targeted and make sure that it has access around the world, but it doesn't help us. And in many ways, it's an obstacle to the work that we're trying to do in organizations like the NED.
Thank you very much, Andy. Why don't we go right to Lilia?
Got it. First of all, it's a great pleasure and it's a privilege to be here. And thank you, Ned, and Chris, you personally, for this kind of challenging project. It's high time. We should have done it even a couple of years ago. But we did it, and I consider the very fact that we present, and now we present in this volume, experience of various types of authoritarian regimes. And we are starting to look at the roots, at the drivers, at the implications of what is happening. It will mean apparently, at least I hope, at least it will mean something for the practical politics, the governments, who will have to reconsider a lot of their agendas, of their strategies, and they have to start thinking now in order to prevent failures and misperceptions that have been so frequent, in analyzing the current world so far. Well, I have a couple of points to present in a way of brushstrokes. First of all, let me start with an ironic paradox. Well, I'm old enough to remember that 20 years ago, we, at least among our friends, we've been debating, with energy and desperation, Frank Fukuyama's argument about the end of history. Well, we differed whether that history ended, but today there are all grounds, all arguments to start debating again whether we have a new end of a new history. And here I mean, the end of the post-Cold War order. And the question is whether it really ended, what it meant for the global community region, for the post-communist world, for the Western community and Europe, and whether really this Western post-modernity with emphasis on pragmatism and with rejection of principles, at least in the foreign policy, really ended, and what it means for us. So, well, in fact, this is, think again about the possible end of the post-Cold War history. And a question emerges, not one question, but the question emerges about the nature of this resurgence, authoritarian resurgence, and whether it is really resurgence, or maybe it's simply, a kind of animation under the influence of some drug, and, well, the dead continue walking to the burial site, to the cemetery. Maybe it's simply a pause in the development of dying systems that do not want to leave the political scene. Or maybe the systems that we thought were dying 20 years ago, they're not dying at all. They have adapted. They have adapted, and are becoming a kind of alternative to liberal democracy. And it's liberal democracy that is fading. There are so many questions, around that. Maybe we have simply, another option of the suicidal statecraft, when the systems that are trying now to adapt, to modernize themselves, using 16th century, 19th century tricks and mechanisms, they simply, would like to constitute some historical pause. And now we are in the pause, whereas the Western community is shocked, political failure, to predict, this kind of pause. Well, there are so many questions, but I have only two brushstrokes, two comments to raise here. Well, first, of course, regarding the Russian system of personalized power, because Chris gave me a responsibility to talk about Russia, not Ukraine, not Belarus, not Kazakhstan, not any stan, but Russia. And I would offer two comments. First, on the internal and external roots and drivers of the Russian system resurgence. What are they? And here I would like to draw your attention again to many paradoxes, dramatic and ironic paradoxes. One of them is the Russian system has been extremely system of personalized power, has been extremely adaptive, extremely skillful, extremely, I would say, yes, hypocritical, but adaptable to many circumstances during the last 100 years. This system has succeeded to change leaders, to change regimes, to change legitimacy, to change justification, to change, the mechanism of survival, to change finally its attitude towards the West. During the Soviet time, well, for nearly 70 years, well, the Russian system of personalized power survived by containing the West, by offering, the world and the West its own idea, well, fake idea, imitative idea, but it was idea. But it was, the mechanism was based on containing, on rejecting the liberal civilization. After 1981, the Yeltsin's Russia and early Putin's Russia started to survive on another basis, but also using the West. We are pretty skillful, Russians, in using the West. But this time, we use the West in a different way. We use the West by imitating liberal democratic principles, by faking it, by penetrating the Western society, by co-opting the Western political elite, politicians, lawyers, media people, think tanks, etc. It was apparently the best and the most brilliant, the amazing example of co-opting the West in order to preserve the interests of the rent-seeking system and the elite. And the Russian system succeeded during the last 20 years. But by 2014, something has happened. It's very interesting. We have to dwell on that. We have to deliberate what really has happened. Why the Russian political system and the Russian political regime decided to change the logic of survival. I'm talking about the new Putin's logic of survival. From penetrating the West, from imitating the West, from embracing the West and dancing with you folks, well, at least with the Western dancers, okay, to containing the West again, deterring the West, and viewing the West as an enemy, turning to the besieged fortress. Well, apparently, the regime and the political leadership and the elite, they have come to conclusion that in the new situation, the resources are dwindling. They cannot control the and they cannot cope with new difficult reality, and they cannot face the challenges, domestic and external challenges. And it would be better, well, at least more wise, to turn to something traditional, something that they know to containment. And I've been discussing with Sid now the metaphor. So here's the metaphor that comes to my head. I hope that at least some of you, or maybe majority, watched the House of Cards series. So before 2013, you know, the Russian system survival was based on the House of Cards mentality, Machiavellism, you know, bribery, manipulation. Well, it's Claire plus, you know, the famous president, the hero of the House of Cards. In 2013, the imperative, the logic has changed dramatically. From the House of Cards, we moved, guess, to what series? Yes, well, he watches series, you know. We moved to the Games of Thrones. Totally different logic, okay? Desperation, bloodshed, revulsion, hatred, violence, whatever. Sexism, too. Sexism is absolutely, you know, indivisible. I'm just looking for a word of one psychology and mentality and ideology of the 20th century. And we have here, and I will just give you an inventory very fastly, we have here now a lot of paradoxes. I'm not sure that you guys, representing other valuable authoritarian regimes, can think about these paradoxes, thinking about your authoritarianism, your areas of expertise. Just look what we have in Russia. Definitely nuclear state, definitely, and possibilities still, and resources to be the superpower, at least regional superpower, the place and the role within the Security Council. And at the same time, we are dealing with the petrostate. It's a very, you know, absolutely wonderful, amazing combination. Petrostate nuclear power. What is the logic? We don't know what it is. Secondly, definitely Russia, with the Russian system of personalized power, wants to be, when we are talking, wants to be the status quo country. The leadership and the regime and the system and the political elite and business elite, majority of them, would like to stabilize the situation, to reproduce the status quo. But how? In order to reproduce the status quo, what they're doing, they're kicking over the global chessboard. They're becoming a revisionist country. So status quo country and revisionist. Isn't it nice? From the intellectual point of view, it's rather interesting to observe. Another phenomenon, and I will be done with paradoxes, the use of the nationalist, ethnic card, Novorossiya, New Russia, the Russian world, the assistance to compatriots abroad. Well, also a very familiar idea from the 20th century, used by other countries. Just remember Germany. But at the same time, it's not the Russian dwelling, Russian insisting on Russian nationalism or ethnic nationalism, because both and the Kremlin and the political elite understand if they continue to press the button of Russian ethnic nationalism, they would be done with the country, because the country is multinational, the country is an empire. So we have adept, very smart, very skillful usage of nationalism in order to save the empire. Isn't it interesting? Well, at least topic for a book. Well, what else? Ukraine. Ukraine became, well, we are talking today, in the morning I was talking about the Ukraine crisis. And, well, I was trying to persuade the audience that Ukraine is very important, but Ukraine, regretfully, became simply a laboratory, the testing ground for the system that doesn't want to die, to get some kind of again, to get some drug to go ahead. So while the field for experiment for the dying system, which wants to find where the red line is. And regrettably, the West does not want even to demonstrate where the red line is. So while the case of Ukraine is very important for survival of this type of the personalized power, but Ukraine, it's also the test. Not only that has not only to demonstrate what is the potential of the Russian authoritarian regime, but the Ukraine is a dramatic case, maybe the most dramatic case in the 21st century, that has to demonstrate whether, you know, the Western community is feasible, is, well, at least can follow its own rules and the principles. And finally, one point may be left. Oh, I have too many points, but I will probably stop here with, oh, you are not still in my paper, no?
No.
What exactly the Russian experience? The experience. Well, I cannot use even the term authoritarian regime. I'm using the personalized power, because what we have in fact, we have a very interesting case of impotent omnipotence, and whether we can call this type of regime authoritarian power, well, I'm not sure that we can. Well, what we have now very interesting experience. Well, when the country is trying to survive, moving in unknown direction, and in fact, the Russian universe, well, that cannot be glued to European part of the continent, that cannot move towards the south, is very interesting, you know, interesting case that will tell whether this kind of 16th century system can survive in the 21st century. What is really important for us, and here I will finalize it, it's very interesting to see to what extent this kind of system can influence the outside world. Because, well, this is what, you know, was the traditional Russian mechanism of survival, using the outside world. And even now, Russia is using the outside world in order to find some stimulus, some incentives, you know, to go ahead, maybe limping ahead. And finalizing, I would only mention one thing. You are still in my points, apparently. Yeah?
I promise.
I promise not. What is finally the impact of the Russian case on the outside community? I do believe that the fate of the Russian system, I do believe that the experiment that we Russians are doing, looking for our new universe, looking for new principle, is very important, because in fact, you know, we are going to prove to what extent we inside of Russia can reform the system that looked, you know, totally unreformable. And the next, you know, at least the next years, we have to understand what will be the logic of Putin's attempt to revive the authoritarian system, to revive the system that tries, you know, to find new mechanisms of legitimation in the world. And we have to deal with the consequences of failure or success. And I don't see any evidence that this kind of system can prolong or replicate itself for a long time. Well, here I will end, now with a funeral note.
Thank you very much, Lilia. Now we'll hear from Fred on Saudi Arabia.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak and for putting together this project. When I heard House of Cards, I used Game of Thrones as my comparison, but you beat me to it apparently. So I think we can all agree that Saudi Arabia is one of the world's last absolutist monarchies. It's at the bottom of the rankings, you know, for virtually every metric of freedom of expression. I think only in the 1990s did you sort of have the faintest glimmer of participatory politics. Majalis Ashura in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Gulf. You have a burst of sort of cosmetic reforms after 9/11 with elected municipal councils, the national dialogue. But I think you've seen since then a real disenchantment that these so-called reforms have not borne fruit. And more worrisome, I think, in recent years, you've seen a real crackdown on dissent. You've seen the codification of draconian counterterrorism laws. King Abdullah's legacy is a bit mixed. I think there was some progress in the education realm and women's rights. But by and large, I think in this current climate, we're seeing a real retraction of freedoms in the kingdom. The theme, I think, in Saudi governance is a sense of political quietism at home to reinforce the idea of having subjects rather than citizens. But what does this mean for Saudi foreign policy? I think we can argue, borrowing from my colleague Tom Carruthers' term here, that Saudi foreign policy is functionally counter-democratic rather than ideologically. In other words, they don't seek to promote their own system of governance. They don't seek to promote autocracy as a matter of but what is happening is that they live in a very rough neighborhood, surrounded by fragmenting states, surrounded by fellow authoritarians. Their foreign policy in this rough neighborhood is security focused, it's defensive, it's realist in intent. But the net effect of their foreign policies has been damaging for the spread of participatory politics, for pluralism, for free media. Partners that Saudi Arabia aids in this fractured region tend to be fellow authoritarians, monarchs, sort of these new military / regimes that we're seeing, or illiberal Salafi actors, quietist Salafis, and the net result, I think, has been quite damaging. A word about Saudi threat perception. I think we have to look at, how does the world look, or how does the Middle East look from Riyadh? The Saudis have always been afraid more of ideological sort of soft power threats crashing across their borders than conventional hard power threats. If you look at the sort of revolutionary waves that have shaken up the Middle East throughout the last century, Saudi Arabia has been an island. It's confounded these predictions that it's going to fall. And so these waves that we've seen, whether it was Pan-Arabism, whether it was Nasserism, Baathism, communism, revolutionary Islamism that was propagated by the Republic of Iran after 1979, the kingdom has endured. But its foreign policy, by and large, has been geared in insulating the kingdom from these ideological threats and also insulating the fellow monarchies of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now, the Arab Spring, the 2011 unrest is really the latest iteration of these sort of ideological waves that are crashing across the region. And from Riyadh's perspective, this is not something to be celebrated. They call it the Arab Troubles. The idea is that it's unleashed a Pandora's box of sectarianism, of newfound prominence for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is tremendously threatening to the Saudis because it has challenged the quietist form of Salafist rule that the Saudis advance. Iranian influence, new forms of jihadism, such as that being advanced by the Islamic State. And so Saudi, I think, foreign policy has stepped into high gear. And again, the idea is to sort of roll back and contain these threats from reaching Saudi shores and from mobilizing the Saudi population. There's this sense that we have of the Saudi population as being happy with what they have. But there's been a lot written on sort of the exaggeration of the Al Saud in terms of their own ability to satisfy their population's needs and the tendency for them to exaggerate internal threats emanating from their domestic sphere. I think we have to recognize that, outside of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has no problem with democratization. Lawrence Whitehead has argued that they have supported elections in places like Bangladesh and in former Yugoslavia. I would argue that even in Saudi Arabia's far abroad in the Middle East, sort of North Africa, perhaps even in Iraq, they have been tolerant of elections, they have been tolerant of democratization, they've supported democratic parties, political parties in these elections. In Tunisia, for instance, they didn't sort of seek to stop that or contain it. But again, the closer we get to Saudi Arabia, and especially within the Arabian Peninsula, GCC, the more robust and securitized Saudi Arabia's counter-democracy policies become. And this is especially true in the GCC. Fellow monarchies, they're bound together by familial links, by economic ties. It's a system within a system. And there's this sense in Riyadh that ideas tend to diffuse within this system. They can jump across borders. And so they want to keep things very quiet. The idea being if you have elections or constitutionalism in one country, civil society mobilization in one country, it will jump to another. And it will also cross sectarian lines. Again, the idea that in many cases Sunni reformists have been inspired by what Shia activists are doing in another country. And this is tremendously alarming for the Al Saud. So again, the GCC in recent years, I mean, it's obviously failed to evolve into a real multilateral external defense organization, but it has been quite effective in maintaining internal security. And so you've seen a real increase in cooperation among ministries of interior, cross-border controls, shared blacklists. The idea being to prevent one country from being a safe haven for dissidents of another country. So for today, for instance, I mean, insulting the rulers of Saudi Arabia will go to jail in Kuwait, and this has happened in a number of countries. There was a Kuwaiti Shia lawyer who was recently thrown in jail for posting tweets critical of the Saudi-led operation against the Houthis in Yemen. So again, the states are banding together. And we've seen a number of new counterterrorism laws that are sort of modeled along the Saudi version that have emerged throughout the Gulf and also Jordan. What are the tools that Saudi Arabia uses to enact this foreign policy that has this damaging result for democracy? Obviously, it's money. I mean, this is a wealthy state. I think we can agree that we've seen Saudi foreign policy leverage its tremendous oil wealth in the service of foreign policy. And Exhibit A in this strategy is, of course, with the ouster of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt and the backing of the Sisi regime in Egypt. $23 billion in aid along with other Gulf states, and this dwarfs the combined $2.8 billion in aid pledged by Washington and the EU. And what this does is it sort of narrows the marketplace for leverage. And when I speak to colleagues in the DoD, you know, the idea of using FMF, foreign military financing, as leverage against the Egyptians, I mean, it's been diminished by Saudi largesse, by Saudi aid. Similarly, in Jordan, I mean, the Riyadh led the GCC, stepped up financial aid to Jordan, pledged about $5 billion in assistance. I think the argument that this has had indirectly a counter-democratic effect because King Abdullah in Jordan feels sort of insulated from the need to undertake real structural reforms to his economy. And so he's made somewhat more cosmetic reforms regarding the electoral law and the premiership. And the payoff for Saudi Arabia has been enormous. So now you see Jordan, they haven't criminalized the Brotherhood, but they're cracking down on figures. They're arresting dissidents who speak critically of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. So again, the payoff, I think, has been very fruitful. Within the Gulf, Saudi subsidies are propping up the Al Khalifa regime in Bahrain. They've also funded a number of pro-regime Sunni Islamist groups in that country. Aside from sort of largesse to governments, the Saudis also maintain robust. They use tribes as pressure points against governments, and we see this obviously in Yemen, in Iraq with the Shamar Confederation. This isn't counter-democratic, but it's a pressure point against often. What about the religious establishment? A lot gets said about that. Again, the religious, the form of Islamism propagated by the Saudis is one of quietism. The notion that oppositional politics is a violation of the Sunnah, that, you know, the role of religious clerics is to be obedient to the ruler. This is rooted deeply in the doctrinal Salafism that is embraced by the Saudi religious establishment. The establishment has links across North Africa, across the Middle East, and what you find is that these religious actors are having a counter-democratic effect by bolstering authoritarian regimes. So you have Salafis in Egypt having a symbiotic relationship with the Sisi regime. There have been quietist Salafis in Libya for quite some time that were supportive of Gaddafi. Gaddafi brought these clerics over from Saudi Arabia to sort of enforce the message that goal of religious clerics is to support the ruler. And so now in Libya you have this strong thing in Bahrain. So the Saudis are supporting Salafi actors in Bahrain that do participate in elections, but they participate in a way that is supportive ultimately of the ruling arrangement of the monarchies. They're not acting as religionists, they're not legislating real laws, they're often focused on morality issues. Oftentimes it's part of what a strategy of what I call sectarian balancing. So they co-opt these Salafi Sunni actors to balance liberals and as Shia. That said, I think when the Al-Saud do support some form of participatory politics, it's often very calibrated, cosmetic, measured. It's elections without real legislation. You do have this obviously at home with these municipal council elections. You have had the Saudis supporting electoral actors in Bahrain, in Iraq. But again, the question is that really leading to democratization, or is it really entrenching the established regimes? Is it giving the Saudis greater leverage into local politics? And then, of course, there's the larger question of soft power, the enormous Saudi media empire that tends to portray Saudi Arabia in a favorable light. I think the that we're seeing here with the rise of the Islamic State, with the rise of Iran, is that the Saudis are sort of this buffer of stability, and certainly they sell that message to the United States. The notion of this impending chaos in this region, they often paint this narrative of inflating the Middle East as not ready for democracy, that the Middle East is prone to sectarian and tribal furies, and they sort of tell their citizenry, well, do you really want to go down the path of reform, because look what's happening in Syria and Iraq. And this is I think a powerful message that is often conveyed in the media, satellite channels such as Al Arabiya or the newspaper Al Sharq Al Awsat. And then, of course, we have military intervention, which appears to be gaining frequency under this Salman doctrine. I mean, we have the decisive storm, now called Restore Hope. The first iteration of this was the intervention of the Peninsula Shield into Bahrain to support the pro-democracy uprisings there. What about the future? Saudi foreign policy is not institutionalized, it's heavily personality-driven. And this, I think, gives us some reason for potential switches and shifts in Saudi foreign policy, depending on which prince occupies a particular portfolio. And we obviously see this with the succession, where the removal of some anti-brotherhood figures, some certain princes, we have seen a realignment of Saudi foreign policy toward the brotherhood that I think is ultimately tactical because of the Iran threat, because of their focus on Yemen. We may see a greater, somewhat loosening under the second and third generation princes. This idea that the effective countering of extremism and jihadism requires some loosening of restriction on political Islamists. Again, I'm not enormously optimistic, but it is a potential that is out there. I think the larger driver of foreign policy shifts is the domestic situation and the enormous demographic and economic pressures that Saudi Arabia faces at home. And specifically with the declining prices of oil, how long can the Saudis rely on reserves? They're not going to touch the subsidies and housing, but regional their gain, and they're already starting to dial back some of their aid to Egypt. So this might bring, perhaps over the mid and long term, some curtailment, some realignment of the kingdom's policies toward Arab transitional states that so far have been very harmful to the growth of political pluralism. So.
Thank you very much, Fred. And in handing over things to Javier, I would just mention when we started this project, we had the feeling with countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, China, which were all in the darkest corners of the Freedom House political governance scales, that Venezuela was somehow a little bit different. And I think since we started this, Venezuela has done its best to move itself in the direction of those other countries. And to Javier's credit, he analyzed and saw that very clearly when we spoke with him about a year ago. So with that, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you all of you for humbling remarks. I don't know if I can live up to these great presentations that we just heard in discussing Venezuela. What I would like to do is, maybe in 10 minutes, if I can, mention 4 points about the study of Venezuela and how it fits into this panorama. All right, number 1, it's not oil that has produced this shift toward greater autocracy. Yes, it is a petrostate, not a nuclear petrostate, and oil, yes. But the movement toward authoritarianism has been steady but fairly consistent since the rise of Chavez. And it has operated under a very diverse set of economic environments. Yes, oil has always been dominant, but the way that the oil industry was structured at the very beginning is very different from now. And so it has happened regardless of the oil environment, suggesting that it's got to be something else. And the article that I wrote tries to think about what is the process that is leading this movement toward greater autocracy in Venezuela. And I come up with the term autocratic legalism, which, if you're thinking it's an oxymoron, yes, it is, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a logic to it. And I try to show how this regime started to, what I mean by autocratic legalism is 3 words: the use, abuse, and lack of use of the law combined to essentially continuously expand the power of the president and crush the power of any veto players, not just in the opposition, but also within the ranks. And so what I do in the paper is to give examples of the use of the law for that effect, the abuse of the law, and the lack of use, if it's necessary, to be lawless at the same time, and how this has proven effective, at least in fooling a bunch of people during every iteration to think that, things are not turning out to be so critical. And before you know it, you end up with a system in no checks and balance after 15 years in office. Okay, point number 2. A remarkable use of economics and trade to advance its foreign policy. And, maybe we just heard how Saudi Arabia is not interested in creating clones. The Chavez model in Venezuela was definitely interested in creating clones, similar regimes in the neighborhood and elsewhere. And if that failed, at least prevent non-clones from criticizing Venezuela, undermine the possible emergence of a regime that defends pro-democracy. And Venezuela was incredibly successful in using money this time, and in this case, oil helps for this purpose. Let me just tell you exactly how Venezuela did it. Number 1, you push for very high oil prices. Number 2, you offer a subsidy to small nations. Very clever, not an invention. This was done before in Venezuela, but Chavez took it to a new level of magnitude. This essentially allowed the Venezuelan government to have significant support of about 15 countries in the Americas, in diplomatic and international institutions. With the non-small countries, what Venezuela did was to become the buyer of last resort. Venezuela's import bill from Latin America went from 12% at the beginning of Chavez to about 25%, buying less from the United States and more from Brazil or Colombia or Argentina, and making those neighbors sufficiently invested in the Venezuelan oil market. This was done deliberately in order to create what I call in the paper for tolerance, so that if you want to create a similar regime as Chavez's, Chavez and the regime he established is ready to give you funds. But if instead you're not interested in this, you have a fairly well-functioning democracy, Venezuela will give you markets so that you think twice before you criticize the regime. Okay, number 3. Point number 3, the soft power of this. Let me tell you an anecdote. Last week, I visited Wellesley College to talk about Venezuela. It was a long I went on and on and on and on about all the ways in which this country is an autocracy. And so, you know, it was unassailable. And somebody raised her hand and said, but inequality has gone down. And I said, there it is, Venezuela's soft power. The idea that if you can convince folks that what you're doing is for the poor, you don't need to develop a modern middle class, or you don't even need to develop a technocratically efficient economy, as long as you are doing welfare politics. People will forgive you. People will see you as being on the right side of history. People will see you as, of course, why do we complain about checks and balances? A pro-poor government should not be receiving checks and balances from minorities. Minorities, after all, are elites. And so I saw this at Wellesley College, which is in Massachusetts. That's it's Hillary Clinton's alma mater, and it's strong there. And I'm like, you know, in many ways, this was the appeal in the global south of a regime like Venezuela's, that as long as you can somehow convince an alternative mode of development of helping the poor, you may not save them from poverty, because in this world of capitalism, that's too much of a task. But if you just give them enough to make it to the day, this is democracy. And this is Venezuela's brilliance. Point number 4, as a way to study what is happening in Venezuela. Unlike my other 3 comparison cases, we just heard it mentioned explicitly during the discussion of Saudi Arabia, this is not a stable country. We have the elements of authoritarianism and a petrostate with this kind of soft power now entering a period of enormous instability. Even under Chavez, the country was so polarized that one would have been too hard-pressed to say that it was significantly stable. But now under Maduro, Chavez's successor, that the economy is crashing in ways that no other petrostate currently is crashing. The cracks in the system are deeper, are bigger, are more worrisome. It's not just the popularity of the president, it's a bunch of other indicators that are failing. And so we don't know what to think about an authoritarian regime that is suffering the potential of sinking this way, that had this kind of international appeal, enormous appeal. Maduro might be unpopular, but the idea of Chavismo is very in Venezuela still. Critics of Maduro often are critics of Maduro because they miss Chavez, not because they regret Chavez. What's going to become of a country like this, you know? And for the sake of time, let me just wrap things up and say this period of instability is remarkable because, and I'll tell you why I think it's remarkable and complex. I told you about my Wellesley College experience last week, but I'll tell you what tends to happen as well in many other meetings, especially here in Washington. People know about the economic collapse of the regime, and the question comes, oh my God, that economy is in such bad shape. How long can the country take it? How long can the government survive? And I think, I don't know, but I can tell you this much. I don't know what's the first thing that is going to perish in Venezuela. Is it going to be this government? Is it the very few democratic institutions that are in place? What we're seeing now in Venezuela is that the arrival of economic duress is providing more mechanisms as well as more justifications to the regime to impose crackdowns. The language is, we're in an economic war, and this is the new ideology. There's no more participatory democracy, it's now we have to fight this economic war. So I am not sure whether in this moment of instability, the inevitable outcome is the end of this experiment, when it could perhaps be the final end of what's little that's left of pluralism in Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javier. So I'd like to start with a question to the panel, and it's triggered by something that Fred said about, if I had it right, that the authorities in Saudi Arabia aren't worried about a whole range of threats. One that they're particularly worried about is the soft power ideas threat, if I got that right. And in all of these cases that we're looking at, one of the things that stands out is that in the age of the internet and the age of globalization, they've been fearsome, without exception, in trying to restrict of what I would call information that counts. So you have very diverse information environments. China's probably the best example of this. Diversity compared with 25 years ago or 30 years ago, no comparison. But when it comes to information about politics and ideas, even though we often say we're in a time of a battle of ideas for a whole variety of reasons, these are very fearful of ideas and go to great lengths to prevent them from getting through their borders. I think in Venezuela's case, you had more diversity and pluralism not all that long ago. That too has been shrinking with the crackdown you've described. But in the other cases we've looked at, while we don't have this war of ideas, it seems, they're still fearful of them in some ways. So maybe you could just offer your thoughts on what exactly is the CCP so fearful of, if you had to boil it, to why they devote so many resources, so many man hours, so much innovation to preventing their flow.
It's a great question because the democratic brand is not especially attractive nowadays. If they were to, we're questioning ourselves so much. Does democracy really work? Frank Fukuyama's latest book. And so I don't know that the Chinese regime is afraid of people learning about the U.S. Senate and its functioning, or the Electoral College, or our election system. So what are they afraid of? It seems to me they're predominantly afraid of looking weak, of people being able to challenge them face to face and say, you did the wrong thing in 1989, or you're doing the wrong thing in Tibet, or you treated Mrs. So-and-so with her house seizure wrong, and I'm going to demonstrate against, sexual harassment of women in the subways, why these 10 Chinese feminists were seized a month or so ago. Is that when it was? About them, that. So they want to show that you can't challenge. I don't know that it's the ideas alone. Now, it is true that I forget who it was who issued a statement. Maybe it was Xi Jinping himself, saying we can't teach from Western textbooks, and there are these cultural and ideological conservatives who, want to be self-reliant and not learn from Western textbooks. They do seem to be afraid of ideas. And then the 7 things you couldn't discuss, constitutionalism and so on, which is an idea. But it seems to me that I'm just guessing that it's the fact that these ideas are used as criticisms, and the regime thinks if it looks weak, as it did in 1989 for a little while, people will crowd in who have all kinds of complaints against the regime. It's a sort of parochial concern. It sounds a little bit like what Fred was describing in Saudi Arabia.
And in the Russian case, if anything, the level of censorship has been rising. Mm-hmm. That's pretty clear. And is that for fear of being seen weak, or is there something more to it?
Chris, the question is a trap for me. Maybe I misunderstand the reality where I'm living in, but it seems to me that, at least in Russia, we moved much more to post-Orwellian reality, which means that there are all ideas on the table, still internet, you can see, you can read anyone, okay? You can read all godfathers and fathers of democracy, but the problem is for information and counter-information, for the informational war, is to make everything relative, is to erase the borders between peace and war, between truth and lie. You can go on internet, by the way, you can see everything about your democracy. But at the same time, you know, there are a lot of gimmicks to persuade the reader and the audience that everything is relative. There is no border between truth and lie. This is apparently the worst possible situation, when everything is becoming relative. And when not war, not weapon, information is becoming the major weapon, because information is discrediting your reality with a question. Yes, we have a lot of problems. The system is corrupted, but what about you? Okay? And what about is the key argument. And we don't know how to fight with that. Without you returning to your principles, and you becoming for us an icon, because we don't have an icon anymore.
So I think we can open it up to questions. If you can raise your hand and then identify yourself. We'll start with Carl Gershman. Is his microphone coming?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, everyone. I want to maybe follow up on what Lilia was just saying, the relativism, and we just can't seem to raise the issue of principle, and ask all four of the panelists, each in his what to do. In other words, here we are in the United States. The United States has a government which presumably has some power. There's Western countries that have economic resources, political power. You have non-governmental organizations, cultural institutions, and so forth. How do you respond to this?
Who would like to start?
Start.
Oh my God.
Yeah, with Venezuela.
Well, I mean, I think this is the puzzle of our times. I mean, I don't want to skirt. I don't know what can be done. If it is correct what Lilia said, that these regimes are developing mechanisms to any type of factual information equally suspect, you cannot work on the basis of information provision. You cannot work on the basis of sanctioning, because we understand that these sanctions always hurt people, not governments. So it's a real conundrum for our times. I don't have an answer, regrettably.
Who would like to go next?
Go.
Fred?
We have an answer. We have
Go ahead.
convent. No.
Let's hear it.
You've got it there. Sorry, I keep messing. Thanks. You know, on this, I want to answer this question, but on this issue of, the Saudi, fear of ideas, I want to point out that an interesting fact that the largest number of, per capita foreign students studying in the United States is from Saudi Arabia, and this enormous scholarship program that King Abdullah undertook, I think was a way to sort of inoculate an entire generation against extremism, and these returning students are going to have an effect on the flow of ideas. And so I think the Saudis, they are afraid of ideas, but there is a class of technocrats, these younger princes, that realize the kingdom has to change in some fundamental ways if it wants to compete on the global economy, if it wants to fix its economic situation. And they are waging this sort of rearguard battle against some very conservative forces. So what should the U.S. do? I mean, look, we in the grand pecking order of priorities, we need the Saudis on the we've got them as counterterrorism allies. Unfortunately, these are driving the train right now. But I think, Obama's public admission to Thomas Friedman, I think, was remarkable, saying almost exactly what I've been saying for a long time, that, the real sort of threat is inside, and you've got these looming challenges. It's not all about external defense. And so delivering those messages, I think, is absolutely key. I think one thing we could do more forcibly is calling out the public, in public, some of the excesses that we see on the human rights front, and sort of this has the effect of focusing the Gulf's attention, especially in places like Bahrain, where they're trying to project this image that they're this sort of liberal hub for investment. So more public, calling out. Conditionality of assistance, I think, is very difficult in the Saudi case. We can use it in other cases in the Gulf. But change is going to be generational. I think the education piece is a real lever that the U.S. has. The fact that you have so many Saudi students coming in, I think it's going to have a long-term effect.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Fred that the education piece is very important, and the calling out, because, to the extent that this is a battle of ideas, it's amazing how many Chinese people really don't know what goes on in their own society. So when you're talking about information control, it's so much about what goes on in their own society that they don't know. So when you ask them about my visiting scholars and my students who are very smart people, and they can get onto the internet and stuff, but you ask them about certain human rights cases, it's amazing what they don't know, including things like Liu Xiaobo that they haven't heard about, some of them. So, and I think that it's hard to sell democracy on the basis of, at the moment, on the basis of democracy's superior performance, because it just looks very bad, and so a lot of, so the Council on Foreign Relations just published a paper about a new China strategy, or who is it, the head of the, Richard Haas, his book. So many people, Frank Fukuyama's book, have said the same thing, is in the end we have to pull up our socks here to regain the prestige that democracy once had. But pending that achievement, pointing out that the performance of these authoritarian regimes isn't as great as it looks. Okay, maybe you didn't say whether inequality had actually been reduced. If that's a fact, and certainly in China, millions of people have been raised out of poverty. Inequality hasn't been reduced, but poverty has been reduced by the statistical thing. Those things are great, but you have to point out the bad things that happen, which information control suppresses. And so this is not a new idea. I think our public information, we've discussed this in Washington, the public information effort of the U.S. government is underfunded and not well managed. That's another area. So there is an idea about battle for hearts and minds as part of this, and it needs to be gone into more seriously, I think, than it is.
Just one comment. It's a very important question, Carl. And you remember that during the Cold War, and while still the communist system existed, while in fact a liberal democracy profited from that, because while the existence of maybe fictional, maybe absolutely unrealizable ideology forced liberal democracy to constantly rejuvenize and practice what you folks preached. And today, authoritarian regimes produce no universal values, no ideas at all. But what they are doing, they are subverting principles inside of your society. So apparently, the most important thing, at least in my view, is to follow the principle, practice what you preach, and somehow deal with the fifth column that we, together with Chinese comrades, with Azeri comrades, from the Central Asian states, etc., are building inside of the Western society. And apparently, it would be the best. It would be the best, way to deal with ideological issues.
A question from Dmitry, and then we'll take some others here. Yep.
Thank you very much, Dmitry Dubrovsky, Reagan Festival Fellow, National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you very much, Lilia Shevtsova, for your presentation. And let me ask you about the, as you remember, three eternal questions of Russian intelligentsia. What to do? There is my glasses. The second question is, speaking about the emulation, speaking about the falsification of the both institutional language of human rights and democracy. How you would evaluate in this perspective what has been done with in the cooperation between Russia and Europe? Because, well, I remember all the discussions between the Russian and European practitioners in the field of human rights and civil society, and the question was, what you're doing? You're supporting these institutions, like, for example, human rights in Russia, to promote the human rights and democracy in the regions and promote human rights and democracy in Russia. But what's in reality happened is these institutions. But till now, the Europeans believe that to support and to promote support of these institutions, this is the best way to support the Russian democracy, to support the Russian institutions of democracy and human rights. How would you react? How we would evaluate how effective was and could be these politics to these kind of institutions within the Russian society? Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I misunderstood the question. Well, I haven't met Europeans, follow this kind of idea, with the exception of maybe German-Russian Forum, which is totally marginalized. It seems to me that during the last 2 years, thanks to the policy of the Russian leadership and thanks to what is happening in Ukraine, it seems to me Russia itself buried all illusions and myths regarding, the Western assistance to these institutions that you are talking about. Well, this is the law of unintended consequences. The Russian political system, the Russian matrix, in fact, is burying all illusions about itself. And what we're talking about, what should Europeans or Westerners do? I don't know, you addressed the question both. It seems to me I responded to this question when I was making a comment to Carl. Practice what you preach when we are talking about the West. I don't think that there is any huge perspective to promote democracy in Russia with an effort of foreign institutions. Well, but I do believe that for the first time in history, in Russian history, the West has tremendous possibilities and resources to influence Russia by dismantling or by influencing the Russian fifth column in the West. So the people who are serving the laundry machine here, just erase Londongrad and you'll have democracy.
So there are several people who want to comment. So let's take several together. We can start in the back and we'll work our way forward here.
Thank you. Emma Louise Leahy from Denton's. And Mr. Wehrey, it seems you've recently described the Saudi-led operation in Yemen as sort of pointing to a quagmire. What is your take on its rebranding as Operation Restoring Hope?
Okay, we'll take a couple more. We can do that. We'll get this gentleman here.
I want to ask about...
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, David Wu. I want to ask about framing. And the discussion about American foreign policy going outward has become framed in terms of engagement or isolation. And framed that way, nobody can be for isolation. But if you reframe it as engagement or imposing limited sanctions, you might get a different result in policy. And it seems to me that I can think of a couple of positive results of sanctions. South Africa and the former Soviet Union come to mind. But I have a hard time thinking of where engagement has thus far resulted in change. And so, I'm open to edification, and I'd like a discussion about engagement versus whatever alternative you see.
Thank you for that. And why don't we come to the front, please?
Abdul Tabuni, the Center for Libyan American Strategic Studies. From the Arab Springs experiment in promoting democracy, we have seen resurgence of authoritarianism. They succeeded, the deep state succeeded in downgrade the principle of democracy, which we can term like the book of called the Cynical Society by Jeffrey Goldfarb, talking about democracy in U.S. They succeeded in having the same thing, especially in Libya, the media, that no need for democracy in those countries. And so what's the role of the think tank here in counter that? Especially the narrative now is democracy is not suitable for that area. And the question after that, what's the role for the China? Why they opposed the United Nations in having force in Syria, like what happened in Libya? So that's, I would like, why China choose to oppose spreading democracy, promoting democracy in that region?
Thank you. And why don't we take we'll take Radwan's question as well.
Radwan Masmoudi with Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. It seems to me that oppressive regimes, authoritarian regimes, are going to do everything they can to defend themselves against democracy, going to try to discredit democracy. But I think we lost this because there is no push for democracy, not only from the United States, but from Europe, from all over the world. The best example is what happened in Egypt. Of course, Saudi Arabia is going to try to stop democracy in Egypt, or the Gulf countries in general are going to try to do that. But what did the United States do against the coup? You know, nothing. We basically allowed the coup to take place, and we're supporting the coup. And so there is no more war of ideas. That's why we're losing the war of ideas, because nobody is battling in support of democracy in Egypt or in Libya or in Syria or anywhere else. You know, we've become accepting of authoritarianism.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe Fred, if you want to take up the regional
Yemen or the
questions, whichever you.
Yeah, I'll start with the Yemen, and I guess I can take that one. Well, the Yemen, the rebranding of this decisive storm to restore hope. I mean, the same risks and concerns are still there. I mean, the airstrikes are continuing. The Saudis haven't stopped the Houthis' advance. I mean, they've met some of their goals with the removal of the ballistic missile threat, but no, I mean, this is sort of a rebranding. They may be shifting some of their targeting toward field than infrastructure, but the larger end state is still unclear. And in that sense, I mean, the quagmire threat is still, very, very present for them. And I mean, I meant quagmire when I wrote that, is especially if they send ground forces in. But an air campaign alone could be very, damaging for them and embarrassing for them. All the Houthis have to do is outlast it, and they're very good at doing that. And they seem to be doing that. So, the regional piece, or what the one the.
Pushing for democracy from the West.
Well, I mean, you would know. I mean, I'm not. If you're sitting in the White House, look. I mean, it's a matter of prioritization. I mean, this is the unfortunate fact, and this tension between realism and values in American foreign policy has always existed. And so, the larger calculus was probably the Gulf states are important to this strategic prize of Iran and counterterrorism. So, how can we wage a war with these allies that we've, with? And so, I just, how do you operationalize what you've just said? But it's absolutely the case. I mean, I focus a lot on Bahrain, and look, I mean, the reason we didn't, push very hard on the gas pedal in Bahrain, this senior White House official told me, is because we were trying to keep the UAE on board. The UAE was screaming, so it's this larger calculus about, ranking of priorities. I mean, this is what I would see.
Well, I guess just to add to that, in the longer term, when you're dealing with so many countries that are inherently unstable, including the largest authoritarian state, for anyone who's interested, I would encourage you to read the issue of the Journal of Democracy with the cluster titled "China at a Tipping Point?" Just to see how the best minds on China think about its governance arrangement. There's a wide range of views, but I don't think in the aggregate you come away thoroughly confident about the governance arrangements there over time, in the broadest sense. Mm-hmm. So I think the question that Mr. Wu asked is a terribly important one, and I might just And that, a large part of this discussion and a large part of the assumption that we've had over the years has been that if we engage and integrate China, Russia, and other countries in our economics and in our global politics and in supranational rules-based institutions, that they would slowly come along as internally they grew and became more, their middle class became more desirous of responsiveness from their governors. This was the assumption. And I think here in these conversations is that, at least right now, the most influential, best authoritarian regimes are active, at a minimum, in, if not promoting their own versions of autocracy or having some sort of offensive idea of this, at least being very creative in how they neutralize what they feel are the aspects of the rules-based system that are most threatening to them. And so in some ways it really challenges this large assumption that we've had that integration would necessarily be good, that mutual dependency would necessarily lead to better outcomes for everyone. Maybe over the long haul it will, but we all know what they say about the long haul. I guess the question more in the mid to mid-long term, let's just say next 10 to 20 years, if things more or less continue as they are with this kind of slow neutralization or at least effort in rules-based bodies by these regimes. In Russia, of course, in the Eurasian and European space, for undoubtedly the most potent at the moment, both co-opting elites and business community in Western Europe while also neutralizing the rules-based bodies there. How, and this maybe builds on Carl's question, how should we think about this conceptually, since we predicated so much of the strategy on integration and this leading to more positive outcomes when there's a bit more ambiguity to this now?
May I start? May I start very briefly? Oh, no. Thank you. In fact, this is the question is a trap, because what we've got in practice after all these myths and hopes that, for instance, Russia or some other countries, being part of the Council of Europe or being part of WTO will accept WTO rules or will accept Council of Europe rules. But in fact, what we see now, some countries like Russia have succeeded in subverting, in manipulating the rules inside of the international institutions. Is it the problem of Russia, of Russians, or Azeri, of Chinese? I don't think so. It's not the problem of Chinese or Russians. This is the problem of liberal democracy. This is a problem of Mr. Former German Chancellor Schroeder, who appeared to be ready to be co-opted, or Finnish Prime Minister Lipponen, who appeared to be ready to be co-opted. So the problem is not our ability to co-opt you, but the ability or readiness of the Russian population, Western population and Western people to be co-opted. So the ball is on your part of the field. I don't know what to do, maybe collective lobotomy or what?
The other country I pay attention to is Cuba, and this debate goes directly into an analysis of what is going on in the United States and between the United States and Cuba right now. Let's do an analysis of Obama's doctrine to Cuba, because it goes to the heart of engagement or disengagement and what does it work. I don't necessarily subscribe to it, but if I understand the president correctly, his argument is the more we engage, the more we can criticize them. Rather than to think in terms of engagement or ostracizing them, let's engage them and criticize them simultaneously. In other words, see whether these two opposites can be done simultaneously. It could very well be about to see an experiment when it comes to Cuba that this is realistic, but it's perhaps the new experiment. The idea is that we're going to be there, we're going to be having normal relations in a bunch of areas, But if for some reason this regime has a particular crisis with the opposition, we are up here defending the good guys here, not the government necessarily. That we earned the right to be that type of foreign presence by being engaged. That we are not going to engage in order to be always on the side of the government, but we're going to engage, but make no mistake about it, at the first sign of trouble in government-opposition relations, the West, the United States, is going to side with the weaker party, the opposition. It's, who knows? Who knows if we're ever going to be able to do that? But that is, in fact, what my reading of what Obama is telling Cuban Americans as he tries to persuade them that his new policy in Cuba will produce regime change. I am skeptical because I think that the United States is it's living in an area in which it is so nervous of losing. It is so nervous of in, or the Russians coming in with their weapons, that they are becoming too accepting of the status quo, to go back to this. But at least Obama, in doctrine, seems to think that one can engage and simultaneously, maybe.
And that the engagement and the economic engagement presumably will lead to political change. But of course, that thesis is being tested in some of the countries we've been discussing over the last 2 hours. So maybe, Fred, do you want to add anything to the engagement idea? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think this alliance between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia is still, robust. I mean, we're not going anywhere. But I think, having this sort of the Saudis that, we share your views about confronting extremism in the region, but the way you're going about it is not sustainable, and it could be furthering extremism down the road. So, the Saudi approach is not sustainable. I mean, both for domestic economic reasons, and so I think the Iran piece of it could lower the Saudi inclination to intervene in a number of these states if there is an Iran that is somehow magically brought into the state system. These two powers won't be competing for influence with one another. But that's only, partially part of the equation. I mean, we're looking, at a state system. The Saudi sort of adventurism is an attempt to sort of manage it in a way that protects their security, but they're doing it in a counter-democratic way. And so, the real question is fixing the larger state system, and that's beyond the scope of U.S. policy over the near term. But I think continued engagement and this message that we're committed to your security, but you have to reframe it in such a way that takes into account what's happening inside your borders.
So thank you. And Andy, would you like to have the final word on maybe the nature or the quality of the engagement with China going forward?
So when you asked about engagement versus sanctions, were you thinking about sanctions on China or on some other country?
I'm not naming any.
Because I don't think sanctions on China are really feasible. So it's not really an option. Engagement has worked in some ways with China. There's been a lot of changes in China, and engagement has something to do with a lot of those changes. And some of those changes have had something to do with human rights, and Fred mentioned students, and so I don't think that engagement is dead and has been useless. And as Chris said, the future may show that continued engagement is helpful. But sanctions are not an option for China, as far as I know. The Chinese don't support intervention on Syria, I think, is because for three reasons. One is, I think the Chinese honestly, sincerely don't think that intervention in Syria or sanctions on Syria will work, probably. Certainly a respectable argument. Secondly, they tend to look at most propositions of this kind from a sort of strategic chessboard point of view of who's putting forward this idea for what benefit, and they often see the U.S. Or American, in this case, not the U.S. government, but U.S. actors taking advantage of instability that happens in different countries to advance the American position in the world. Get rid of, Gaddafi has trouble, so we're going to go in there and sort of get rid of Gaddafi, take advantage. And the Chinese and the Russians, as we know, feel that that's exactly what happened in the Libya scenario, is that the Americans took advantage of them when they allowed this resolution to go through the Security Council. So that's a second reason. They don't think it's beneficial. They don't want to be tricked by the Americans. Thirdly, I don't think that, as I was saying in my original presentation, the Chinese have good relations with as many countries as possible, and where there's a lot of disagreement in a region here, they have relations with Iran, for example, that are important. They don't want to take sides with one group in a particular region. If the region is agreed about something, as the Arab Union was about Libya or the African Union about Sudan, the Chinese are happy along with it.
Well, we've covered a considerable amount of terrain, and I thought all the speakers did this in a remarkably thoughtful and insightful and sober way. And for that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all four of them and to thank all of you for participating and being here. Thanks very much.
Thank you.